The cemetery was silent, except for the steady drizzle of November rain tapping against the marble tombstones. A billionaire woman, Victoria Blackwood, walked with her usual air of control, clutching a bouquet of white lilies meant for her only son who had died years earlier. She expected solitude, a moment of private grief, but what she found instead left her breathless. Kneeling in front of her son's grave was a young black waitress in a faded uniform, holding a small child who sobbed as though his world had ended. The sight was jarring, out of place, inexplicable, and somehow threatening to the carefully controlled life Victoria had built. The billionaire's eyes froze on the child. His delicate face, framed by rain-soaked curls, carried something hauntingly familiar, and then she saw it. His bright green eyes, the same piercing eyes her son once had, the same eyes she had stared into for decades. In that moment, Victoria realized this was no ordinary child, and this was no ordinary encounter. What was this waitress doing at her son's grave? Why was she crying as if she had lost everything? And most disturbing of all, what secret could connect her dead son, this young woman, and the little boy with the eyes that mirrored her family's bloodline? Before we begin, don't forget to subscribe to Hidden Black Stories, where we uncover powerful tales of injustice, resilience, and truth that too often go untold. The Blackwood name was one of power. For generations, it symbolized wealth, privilege, and untouchable influence. Victoria Blackwood, now in her mid-50s, was the heir to an empire built on business deals, corporate takeovers, and ruthless decisions. People feared her presence in boardrooms, admired her influence in politics, and whispered her name in hushed tones at charity galas. Yet behind the glamour and iron reputation, there was one deep crack in her carefully constructed world: the death of her only son, Adrian. Adrian had been just 28 years old when a car accident ended his life. To Victoria, his death was more than personal loss. It was the end of her legacy, the extinguishing of the bloodline she had placed all her hopes on. For 3 years, she visited his grave with the same white lilies, her only attempt at grief in a life otherwise marked by control. She believed she knew every secret Adrian had ever kept, every relationship he ever entertained. To her, his life had been thoroughly investigated after his passing, leaving no mysteries behind. Or so she thought. That November afternoon, the drizzle fell heavier as Victoria approached the familiar marble tomb. She had expected silence, only to be struck by the shocking sight of a stranger. The young black waitress kneeling at Adrian's grave seemed fragile and determined all at once. Her uniform bore the name of a local diner, Bell's, a place Victoria had probably passed 100 times but never entered. The woman's tears were not polite or restrained. They carried the weight of grief too raw to fake, and in her arms was the small boy, perhaps 4 years old, clinging to her as though she were his only anchor. Something about that boy unsettled Victoria. His hair was dark and curled, his skin a warm brown that marked him clearly as biracial. But his eyes, those piercing green eyes, were impossible to ignore. They mirrored Adrian's eyes exactly. Eyes Victoria saw in family portraits, in old home movies, even in the mirror when she herself was younger. The billionaire felt her breath catch. Could it be possible? Could her son have hidden something so monumental from her? Victoria's first instinct was denial. A waitress? A child? No. Adrian had never mentioned a woman, let alone one with a child. Yet the undeniable evidence was staring her in the face. The waitress, Jasmine Washington, lifted her head, her expression full of sorrow but also strength. This was not the look of someone who stumbled into the wrong place. She was here with purpose, as though her connection to Adrian's grave was deeply personal. Victoria's mind raced. Why would this woman be mourning at Adrian's resting place? And why, above all, did her child carry features that screamed of the Blackwood bloodline? Though she tried to steady herself, Victoria's hands trembled against the bouquet of lilies. If what her instincts whispered was true, this moment could shatter everything she thought she knew about her son, her family, and the legacy she fought so hard to protect. The drizzle turned into rain, soaking the earth, but none of them moved. The image seared into Victoria's mind, a wealthy billionaire standing powerless in front of a grieving waitress and a child whose eyes could unravel her world. Victoria knew she could not walk away. She had to learn who Jasmine Washington was, and why her presence at Adrian's grave felt like fate colliding with her carefully guarded secrets. What began as a private moment of grief was now the start of something far larger. An unraveling that would drag Victoria into a world she had spent her entire life avoiding. A world of class divides, of racial prejudice, of hidden truths buried beneath power and privilege. And deep inside, a fear began to grow. This waitress was not merely grieving, she carried answers. Answers Victoria may not be ready to face. Victoria left the cemetery that day unsettled in a way she had not felt in decades. Her life had been built on control, controlling companies, controlling people, controlling narratives. Yet the image of that black waitress holding a child at Adrian's grave refused to leave her mind. It haunted her through board meetings, distracted her during high-stakes negotiations, and even followed her into restless sleep. Who was Jasmine Washington, and what connection did she have to Adrian? Victoria's instincts sharpened into suspicion. She had risen to the top of American industry by knowing when to trust her gut, and her gut told her that this woman was dangerous. Not because of wealth or influence, but because she carried something Victoria could not buy or silence: the truth. Within days, her mansion's private library became a war room. Thick reports from investigators piled high on her mahogany desk. Every detail of Jasmine's life was laid bare: a single mother in her 20s, working grueling hours at 2 jobs to make ends meet, a 1-bedroom apartment in a decaying neighborhood, no family ties that could provide support, no college degree, no powerful allies. To Victoria, it was a pitiful story, a fragile existence easily crushed by the weight of Blackwood power. And yet, something did not add up. For all the investigators unearthed, one detail remained glaringly absent. There were no official records of the boy's birth, no hospital files, no certificates, no trail that confirmed who his mother was. It was as if the child had appeared out of thin air. To Victoria, this silence screamed of secrets. The thought gnawed at her. If the boy was indeed Adrian's, then he was her grandson, the last living heir to the Blackwood name. But the notion filled her not with joy, but with fury. Fury that Adrian would keep such a secret from her. Fury that this waitress believed she could raise a child of Blackwood blood without Victoria's permission. And most of all, fury that her empire, her legacy, might be bound to a world of poverty and blackness she had always considered far beneath her. Still, Victoria could not deny the truth written in the boy's features. Every time she stared at the photographs her investigators snapped from a distance, she felt her chest tighten. Those eyes were undeniable. Across town, Jasmine continued her life in quiet determination. Each day, she dressed in her diner uniform, served coffee to strangers, and endured the long hours that left her body aching. But what no one saw were the late nights after Tyler was asleep, when she spread textbooks across her small kitchen table. Law books, business manuals, case studies. She consumed knowledge as if her survival depended on it. Because it did. Jasmine knew the storm would come. She knew a woman like Victoria Blackwood would not see Tyler's existence and simply walk away. Wealth like Victoria's was not content with silence. It demanded ownership, and when ownership was threatened, it turned ruthless. The imbalance between them was staggering. On one side, billions of dollars, armies of lawyers, politicians in back pockets. On the other, a young black mother with little more than grit, intelligence, and an unshakable promise she had made years earlier to protect Adrian's child at all costs. The world would not see them as equals. To most, Victoria was power personified, while Jasmine was disposable labor. The waitress uniform itself told a story of long hours, low pay, and invisibility. Yet in that invisibility, Jasmine held a quiet power Victoria had underestimated. As weeks passed, the tension between their worlds grew. Victoria's resolve hardened. She convinced herself she was not acting out of cruelty, but out of responsibility. The Blackwood legacy demanded a rightful heir raised in privilege, not poverty. In her mind, Jasmine was unfit. Her race, her class, her lack of pedigree were proof enough. But Jasmine was preparing in ways Victoria could not see. She was not simply waiting to be attacked. She was sharpening her defenses, cultivating allies, and documenting truths Victoria had spent her life burying. The two women stood on opposite ends of society's spectrum, but both were propelled by fierce determination. One clung to power and image, the other clung to love and justice. And as their paths inched closer, it became clear that this was not just a personal battle over a child. It was the collision of privilege and prejudice, of wealth and resilience, of a world that believed everything could be bought, and a woman ready to prove that some things never could. The stage was set. What began in silence at a cemetery was building toward a confrontation that would shake the walls of power, drag buried secrets into the light, and force both women to reveal who they truly were when stripped of their armor. And Victoria Blackwood, for the first time in her life, was about to discover what it felt like to lose control. The first meeting between Victoria Blackwood and Jasmine Washington did not happen in a boardroom nor in a courtroom. It happened in the unlikeliest of places, the small diner where Jasmine worked long shifts to keep food on her table. Victoria's arrival was like a storm breaking through calm skies. The expensive black car, the designer heels clicking against linoleum floors, the sharp scent of perfume too foreign for such a modest place. All of it announced her presence before she even spoke. Conversations hushed, forks froze midway, and all eyes turned toward the billionaire in their midst. But Victoria saw only one thing: the young black waitress in a faded uniform, her son coloring quietly in the corner booth. To outsiders, it looked like a chance encounter, but to both women, it was inevitable. The confrontation they had been circling since that rainy afternoon at the cemetery had finally arrived. Victoria's gaze burned with cold determination as she studied the child. Every feature confirmed what she already knew. This was Adrian's son, the last Blackwood, the heir she had been denied. In her mind, Tyler did not belong in a diner surrounded by chipped coffee mugs and grease-stained menus. He belonged in penthouses, private schools, and country estates. He belonged to her. Yet as she stood there, Jasmine did not cower. She continued her work with quiet composure, her every movement deliberate. Her posture carried no wealth, no privilege, but it carried something Victoria had not expected: dignity. The kind of dignity that cannot be bought, silenced, or erased. The tension that filled the diner was suffocating. Customers sensed the weight of something far larger than an awkward encounter. They witnessed a silent battle of wills. One fought without raised voices, but with the raw force of presence. And though Victoria had the power of an empire behind her, in that moment, she found herself unnerved by the stillness of the woman before her. Victoria's strategy had been simple: intimidation. Her investigators, her lawyers, her endless resources, they were weapons sharpened for this very confrontation. She believed she could dismantle Jasmine's life with a single signature, evict her, bankrupt her, even destroy her reputation. To Victoria, Jasmine was nothing more than an obstacle to be erased. But Jasmine had already prepared for this war. Quietly, without fanfare, she had gathered documents, photos, and testimony that painted a very different picture. Of Adrian, of their relationship, and of the promises he had made before his death. Promises that tied him not to the empire his mother built, but to the small family he had created in secret. Victoria underestimated the depth of Adrian's rebellion. For years, he had suffocated under the weight of his family's expectations, their obsession with image and control. His love for Jasmine had been the one place he felt free, and Tyler was not an accident. He was a choice, a deliberate act of defiance, a life Adrian had chosen away from his mother's shadow. Now, that choice stood in front of Victoria as undeniable proof that her control had never been absolute. The days following the diner confrontation spiraled into chaos. Legal papers were filed, threats exchanged, private investigators dispatched to dig deeper. For Victoria, this became more than reclaiming an heir. It was about crushing defiance. For Jasmine, it was about survival, about refusing to let her son be swallowed by a world built on prejudice and privilege. The imbalance was staggering. Victoria's wealth turned every battle into a mountain. Judges who owed her favors, lawyers who bent the truth with ease, headlines that painted her as a grieving mother trying to save her grandson from poverty. And beneath those headlines, the unspoken undertone of race, the insinuation that Jasmine, as a black waitress, was inherently unfit to raise a child of privilege. But what Victoria failed to see was that the world was changing. Whispers of her cruelty began spreading. Journalists caught wind of inconsistencies in her narrative. Community leaders who once stayed silent began rallying behind Jasmine, recognizing in her struggle the story of countless others who had been stripped of dignity by the wealthy and powerful. The battle reached its breaking point in a courthouse heavy with anticipation. On one side sat Victoria Blackwood, draped in wealth and arrogance, her legal team stacked like soldiers ready for war. On the other sat Jasmine Washington, wearing her best but modest clothes, clutching the evidence she had spent months preparing. As arguments echoed through the chamber, one truth could no longer be ignored. Adrian had loved Jasmine. He had chosen her, chosen their son, chosen a life outside the gilded cage of his mother's empire, and the evidence was undeniable. Photographs, letters, financial transfers, all of it pieced together a story Victoria had tried to bury. The revelation shattered the image Victoria had crafted for years. Her control was slipping, her power cracked open by truths she could not rewrite. For the first time, she found herself staring at the possibility of loss, not just of a legal battle, but of the narrative that had defined her very existence. And in that moment, all her billions, all her influence, all her ruthlessness could not erase one simple fact. The bloodline she fought so desperately to protect was not hers to control. The gavel's echo faded into silence, but its impact reverberated through the room like thunder. For the first time in her life, Victoria Blackwood had not won. The evidence laid bare had been undeniable, the story irrefutable. Adrian had chosen Jasmine and Tyler. The court recognized not only Jasmine's right as a mother, but also her integrity in protecting the truth when it would have been easier to disappear. For Victoria, it was a humiliation deeper than any corporate defeat. She left the courthouse shielded by her lawyers and bodyguards, but no amount of designer silk could mask the cracks in her empire. The world outside the courtroom no longer saw her as an untouchable billionaire. They saw her as a mother who had tried to erase her own grandson because he did not fit the image she crafted. Whispers followed her to every gala, every meeting, every public appearance. Journalists who once praised her ruthlessness now dissected it with venom. Community leaders she ignored for decades turned her into a cautionary tale about the corruption of wealth and the blindness of privilege. And in her mansion's endless halls, silence became unbearable. Adrian's portraits no longer offered comfort. They accused her. His eyes, those same green eyes Tyler now carried, seemed to demand an answer she could never give. Meanwhile, Jasmine returned to her modest apartment with Tyler, not as a woman defeated, but as one transformed. She had walked into a courtroom armed with little more than truth and dignity, and she had walked out victorious against a machine designed to silence women like her. Life did not suddenly become easy. She still worked long hours, still faced bills stacked on the counter, still bore the exhaustion of single motherhood. But she carried something far greater now, the knowledge that she had stood against one of the most powerful women in America and refused to be erased. And that knowledge gave her strength not only for herself, but for Tyler. Tyler, too young to understand the weight of what had unfolded, sensed the shift. His mother's tired smile carried pride instead of fear. His bedtime stories were no longer whispered in the shadow of secrets, but told freely, filled with memories of the father he never knew but who had loved him deeply. Jasmine made sure Tyler understood that his father's choice had been deliberate, that he was not a mistake, but a legacy Adrian had cherished. The community around them began to notice. Neighbors who once looked past the quiet waitress now offered small acts of kindness. Strangers stopped her at the diner, not to pity her, but to thank her, for standing up, for refusing to be silenced, for representing those who had been trampled by wealth and power. Jasmine had not sought attention, yet her story resonated far beyond her small world. It became a symbol of resistance, a reminder that dignity cannot be bought. And what of Victoria? She retreated behind iron gates and locked doors, her empire intact, but her soul fractured. The world she built had been exposed for what it truly was, not strength, but fear. Fear of losing control, fear of imperfection, fear of the very humanity she had tried to bury beneath diamonds and glass towers. At night, she sometimes drove in secret to the cemetery, standing before Adrian's grave as rain fell on marble. She would trace the name with trembling fingers, whisper apologies too late to be heard. But even in those moments of vulnerability, she could not escape the truth. Her son had chosen love over legacy, compassion over wealth, humanity over empire. And she, with all her billions, had been powerless to stop it. The rain washed away nothing. For Jasmine, the path ahead was not free of hardship, but it was hers to walk. She enrolled in night classes, determined to finish her education and build a future not just for herself but for Tyler. Each step forward was a defiance of the world that had once tried to write her story for her. Each success, no matter how small, was a victory over centuries of systems designed to hold women like her down. Tyler grew with the knowledge that he carried two legacies, one of power, wealth, and privilege that sought to control him, and another of resilience, dignity, and love that fought to protect him. The world would one day force him to reconcile these truths. But thanks to his mother, he would grow up knowing that his worth was not defined by money or bloodlines, but by the choices he made. In the end, this story was never about a billionaire or a waitress. It was about the invisible war between two worlds, the world of unchecked privilege and the world of quiet resilience. A war fought not with money or violence, but with truth and the refusal to be erased. Victoria's downfall was not written in courtroom papers or news headlines. It was written in the silence of her empty mansion, in the absence of a grandson she could never claim, in the hollow echo of a legacy shattered by her own hands. And Jasmine's triumph was not written in wealth or fame. It was written in the smile of her son, in the quiet strength she carried, in the community that now saw her not as invisible, but as undeniable. The cemetery where it all began still stands. The marble grave still bears Adrian's name. And sometimes, on quiet afternoons, Jasmine and Tyler visit, not in secret, not in fear, but in remembrance. Tyler places flowers with his small hands. Jasmine whispers stories of the man who loved them both, and the rain falls softly as if the earth itself listens. And perhaps in those moments, Adrian finally rests, not as the heir to an empire, but as a man remembered for the choice he made. Because in the end, it was never money, power, or legacy that endured. It was love. And so I ask you, when history remembers us, will it remember the wealth we amassed, the power we wielded, the titles we wore? Or will it remember the love we gave, the dignity we protected, and the truths we refused to silence? The answer, perhaps, is the legacy that truly matters.